Why would what?
Why would he use nuclear weapons, given that he would immediately get vaporized?
Because he would not immediately get vaporized. He could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine and we would not retaliate.
What, you
and
think
Ukraine
Russia could use it?
Hang on.
You think Russia could use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine and America would just stand by and let that happen? That NATO would stand by and let that happen? They would allow a Russian dictator to use nuclear weapons on a European sovereign country?
I certainly believe that. We are not going to use nuclear weapons if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Of course we are.
I don't know anybody who argues, because yes, we'd get incinerated. The logic that you laid out a minute ago would apply to us.
Yeah, but the whole point of MAD...
No, they wouldn't.
Well, the whole point of MAD is that both sides understand if somebody pressed that button, everyone gets incinerated. That's the point of it, mutually assured destruction. That's why no one uses them.
No, that's not the way. No, that's not the way it works when it comes to Ukraine. Ukraine has no nuclear weapons of its own. The Russians can use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They cannot retaliate, and we would not initiate nuclear use against Russia in response because we would end up getting incinerated in your story. We would be deterred by MAD.
But so would they.
No. They would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, knowing full well that it would be extremely unlikely that we would retaliate with nuclear weapons of our own.
I would think it would be 100% likely. Otherwise, Russia can fire nuclear weapons at anybody. And no one's going to stand for that. Why would they?
No, it cannot fire nuclear weapons at anybody. Firing nuclear weapons at the United States is fundamentally different than firing nuclear weapons at Ukraine.
Why?
This is a very different situation.
Why is it?
Because the United States has nuclear weapons and Ukraine does not. And if you hit the United States with Russian nuclear weapons, the United States will retaliate against Russia, and you'll be in a general nuclear war. If the Russians use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, Ukraine cannot retaliate, and we're not going to start a nuclear war on their behalf. It's a fundamentally different situation. The other point I'd make to you is you do not want to underestimate the risks that great powers are willing to take when they're backed into a corner. Your belief is the Russians would never use nuclear weapons. Why would they do that? Well, the fact is, when great powers are backed into a corner, they sometimes pursue remarkably risky strategies. And one could hypothesize a situation where the Russians use nuclear weapons in a very limited fashion against NATO, understanding full well that there might be some retaliation, or there's likely to be some retaliation, but understanding that in that circumstance, because they're desperate, it makes sense to try to get both sides out on the slippery slope, to use limited numbers of nuclear weapons to send a message to the West that they're playing with fire. That could happen. Is it likely? No. But I certainly would not say there's never any chance that the Russians, or Putin in particular, would use nuclear weapons.
I think he'd like people to think that he would, but I don't think he would in a million light years.